Today we're going to look at flash fiction. What is flash fiction? Well, in general, flash fiction is fiction that is under 1500 words, usually under 1000 words, and very often significantly shorter. So, for example, you have the Drabble, which is a story of exactly 100 words, or you have the 6 word story, or the 42-word story, or the story that just fits into a tweet, which is called micro flash fiction. And it's really a good idea to try and exercise your skills as a fiction writer using this sort of very short format. So, basically, your flash fiction story needs to have it all. It needs to have character, it needs to have plot, it needs to have milieu. So if you think about Orson Scott Card's Mice, where he says that basically any fiction story has to various extents the following elements, namely milieu, where your story is a set idea, the sort of big governing idea, the philosophical idea of your story, then character, namely the characters and how they react with each other, and then event, what happens to them. And that you can all do in the space of under 1000 words and sometimes even under 500 words or less. So, how do you begin? Well, usually you begin with an idea. It has to be something compact. Probably not a multi-generational story with dozens of characters, although I suppose you could find counterexamples to that, but most flash fiction that I read is very constrained in time. Maybe there's 1 to 2 characters, there is a focused action. And as I was communicating with Frances Howard Snyder, who is a philosopher and an author of short stories, usually romance, she says what usually works well is if you put a protagonist in a difficult situation. That's how you create an interesting plot. So you have your protagonist, you put them in a difficult situation, and then you see what happens. Now, your very first draft, you don't have to worry too much about how long your story is going to be. Don't feel hemmed in by the word count, just write. And it's only once you've written that it's time to polish. And you need many drafts. You don't have to worry about, oh, I'm already at my 3rd or 4th draft. You can do 10 drafts if you need to. That is because with flash fiction, every sentence really has to do work. Ideally, each sentence, particularly if you have a story that's 500 words or less, it needs to do double work. Ideally, a sentence needs to advance the character and the plot. If it doesn't, then wonder, what can I do to make this sentence work for me? Suppose that you have just a sentence that sets the scene, which is totally fine in a novel, but in a very short piece of flash fiction, you might wonder, what can it do for me? And then maybe if you have just scene setting, you could think about how the character reacts to it. So you have gorgeous prose, beautiful sentences, read it aloud. That is particularly important, so you have to sort of develop this oral sense that Ursula Le Guin talks about in Steering the Craft. Try to listen for yourself how it sounds, try to find interesting ways to say something, novel ways to say something. That being said, there are a few problems and difficulties when you're writing flash fiction, as you are writing any kind of fiction. And one of those is just that the story is not understandable. And even some published flash fiction that I read, I just wonder what is going on, what's happening here. So this is something you typically don't want. A bit of mystery is okay. So a flash fiction story can be really open-ended, but it needs to be understanding. If your reader is just profoundly puzzled, then probably something is wrong. Relatedly to this, you have to be aware of just not having a twist that no one saw coming. It just doesn't work in flash fiction because flash fiction is so short. Some writers have the sort of idea to write this as a joke. So you have the setup and then you have the twist that nobody sees coming. Now, a twist is okay, but actually you need to set it up in advance. You need to give enough indications that it's going to happen. Otherwise, the reader will just feel cheated, which you don't want. And then finally, there's just the sort of worries that you might have with flash fiction, as you have with any kind of fiction, and that is to avoid tropes such as somebody just wakes up and doesn't remember anything, and then the story begins. It's a sort of easy way to set up And there are some stories like that really work well, but in general it's an overused trope, and you have to be careful not to use it. So an original, within the confines of a flash fiction story, it's important to find something original, some novel idea to discuss. uh, and then also, as with writing short fiction, you can just start writing however you want, but then once you start trimming, you have to wonder, do I really need to begin here? Or could I cut and only begin here, where the action is actually starting? Because there's really no reason to have a lengthy intro, particularly if you have 1,000 words or less. It's important to jump right into it, and then you conclude. And you have to give the reader some sense of satisfaction, even if it is open ended, even though people could say, wow, there's a whole world waiting out there and feels open ended. It's still important to give your reader that sense of satisfaction that they've spent a short time with your story and they feel happy and satisfied with the ending. Doesn't mean it has to be a happy ending, but it has to give some sort of closure to the reader.